To all the viewers of the Diplomacy Next podcast, I am being joined by Mr. Mudassir Quamar, who has been on this podcast, I mean, two, three times earlier. But given the gravity of the topic, I was having no other guest but to dial him for the specific and the specialized uh, expertise on this particular area that we'll be talking about. First of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Mudassir Quamar back on this podcast, sir.
Thank you, Mehraj, and I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, it's always an honor, sir, to be honest enough. The reason being the candidness and the amount of insightful information and analysis you have been adding to this podcast. It has always been like, adding kind of a value to this entire series of conversations that I have been conducting via Diplomacy
Thank
Next.
you,
So,
thank you.
so it's always an honor. I hope that in the next month or so, or after 2 months, we'll have another podcast that will be looking at us from a distance as of now. But then for this time being, today we are actually looking forward to understand this corridor that has been recently announced after the end of the G20 meeting that was held in New Delhi in last week, and its importance. Apart from that, we'll be also looking at the larger Middle Eastern geopolitics and the current developments also, if the time permits. Uh, First of all, I'd like Mr. Mudassir Quamar sir to actually delve into this thing, that as a researcher, as a scholar, what are his takeaways from this G20 summit as the geopolitical expert? Over to you, sir.
No, if you look at the G20 summit, there are some very significant takeaways. First of all, I mean, the whole discussion about Ukraine being the center point of, G20 last year, that had led to a lack of, issue of any declaration. And the way New Delhi or India was able to, diplomatically bring about a Delhi declaration with every parties involved in the G20. I think that was a major success. In other words, to remain focused on the important issues facing the world, whether it is the issue of sustainability, whether it is the issue of post-COVID economic recovery, whether it is the issue of climate change and fighting climate change, or any other issues which the world is facing today, to remain focused on that, to bring about a consensus of such a vast number of countries and organizations. That was, I think, a extraordinary achievement as far as India is concerned. The other point of bringing up, the African Union to the membership of G20, I think that will leave a lasting impact, a lasting legacy for India's G20 presidency. The third point, which I would underline, is the theme of India's G20. And that is something which is very important to bring about a fact that India is looking at the world, not just internally or its immediate region. And that gives a very important message that from an Indian point of view, we are looking at the world, not just our immediate neighborhood, or we are not just inward looking. So I think these were very important takeaways. There obviously the way, I mean, the event itself was successfully conducted. That also underlined the ability of India to execute such a large scale diplomatic event. So all these things put together, I would say that it was a very successful G20 meeting.
That's quite interesting. I mean, given the way the placement of India as the president of G20, now it has shifted to, it has been given to, on the rotation basis, it will go to Brazil. But then when we look back at this event, when we talk about the leaders that have participated in this event, especially from the West Asia or Middle Eastern region, the importance of Mohammed bin Salman's participation and his inclusion into the in this event, that has left a legacy for the larger engagement of India and the Middle East, broadly speaking. But if we can, since the corridor has been announced, it's India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, if I'm properly pronouncing it. What was the background work that has been done, and how is it important, if we talk about geopolitics of things, the corridor and its background, that will give us a glimpse of why it was brought in at this particular event.
If you look at the India's trajectory of India's relations with the Gulf and West Asian countries, uh, it is focused on trade, economy, business, investments, and two-way flow of investments, Indian expatriates going to the region, and the energy security aspects. So far, India has not tried to engage the region as a whole. It was largely engagement with individual countries. So India had very good relations with, let's say, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and other countries, Egypt, Israel, and so on. Gradually, in the last few years, India has started to look at the region as a whole. So from bilateralism, there is a shift to regionalism in West Asia. And that is where this idea of engaging the region as a whole through a trade or economic corridor is significant. If you look at it from the economic point of view, the Gulf region is India's largest trading bloc. 30% as of 2022-23, 30% of India's petroleum, 70% of India's gas requirements are met by imports from these Gulf countries. If you look at the amount of trade India has with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, in 2022-23, it was close to US dollar 240 billion, the largest in terms of a block of countries. If you look at the second largest or the third largest, it is Europe and Southeast Asia. So the and if you look at the trade between Europe and the GCC countries or the Gulf countries and other West Asian countries, that is also significant. Now there is no, as of today, no institutionalized infrastructure, logistics, and supply chain system to link these regions through trade and business. There are certain infrastructure already available. For example, if you look at from India to Gulf, there is already robust trade. From Gulf and West Asia to Europe, there is already robust trade. But there are gaps in terms of infrastructure. What this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor proposes to do is to bring about a significant enhancement of infrastructure, logistics, supply, and business, business chain, to be able to have a seamless trade between India to Gulf to the Fertile Crescent region, Israel, Jordan, Israel, and from there to Mediterranean and Europe. This is something, in my opinion, an extraordinary development. If you look at it from the point of view of geoeconomics, this is significant because the world needs connectivity, the world needs better trade, the world needs better, economic growth. All these three regions have extraordinary economic potentials, but they have not yet been connected the way they should have been. And this is also goes back to, if you look at historically, the Gulf region, the West Asia region has always been at the cross section of trade route between Europe and Asia. So in a way, it is also a revival of that, ancient and medieval trade routes. And this is something which is going to be, if it is executed, well, if it comes about well and it starts working well, it is going to be a significant challenge for any other, block of countries in terms of trade and economy. So, if one looks at it from the point of view of geopolitics, it will be a serious challenge or competition to what is called as the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And this is important not only because of the proposal being, about trade and economic corridor. It is also important because the Gulf countries have, over the last, decade or so, worked very hard to bring about an economic transformation at home, mainly in preparation for a post-oil or post-petroleum kind of economic, future. And that also makes this economic corridor important, and it intersects in, the European quest for economic revival, the Indian quest for fast economic growth, and the West Asian Gulf quest for economic transformation. So, in that sense, this is something very, very important. And the United States being part of this also indicates that there is a change of attitude from the Biden administration as far as this very important region, the Gulf and Middle East region, is concerned.
That's quite interesting. If we talk about, Mohammed bin Salman and President Joe Biden, being kept uh, very near on the table when they were talking, they were addressing to the audience, and they were talking in between. Uh, there is one thing that you have mentioned about is that it will be a big challenge for China's Belt and Road Initiative. There are certain things that the countries aren't happy with, or the partners who have actually been part of this Belt and Road Initiative, powered by China. This corridor, as it's in the memorandum of understanding yet, it's in the earlier phase. It has to be rolled out, the finances and the other parts and the things that may come into its way. But largely, if we talk about the China's Belt and Road Initiative and this new corridor that has been announced, is there some sort of comparison that we can draw how it can be readily, accepted by the larger group of countries in the Middle East, and for that matter, in the European world? Where do you see that connection between the two things?
See, there is something called economic sense. Although I'm not an economist, but there are some very basic aspect about economic sense. Economy works if it is in the interest of everyone involved. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, there was a lot of, much of fanfare around it, lot of talks around it. But if one looks at the trajectory of China's economic growth, it has slowed down. And that is one reason why China has been trying to go all out rather than just focusing on the domestic economic, issues. And although if as you mentioned, while there has been a lot of discussions about Belt and Road Initiative, there were challenges, problems with regard to smaller countries finding it difficult to really uh, engage in terms of profitability, the cost and benefit aspect of it, and also sometimes, for example, issues related to debt diplomacy, the problems such as two examples in South Asia, the question of economic problems in Sri Lanka, and then the economic challenges facing Pakistan. So if one looks at the Belt and Road Initiative, it is almost a decade now that this has been rolled out. It has not really delivered on the promises, on its early promises. And that is where, and it's not as if the Gulf countries were not really enthusiastic about it. If you look at Saudi Arabia, if you look at UAE, if you look at Kuwait, and other regional countries also, they have also been talking about, have signed agreements to have cooperation with China on Belt and Road Initiative and other connectivity and other strategic economic partnerships. But that has not really delivered. And this is where the IM, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor has to be seen. There is a potential where this can deliver because India is growing. India is at a stage where it will continuously grow over the next decades in terms of its economic growth. India has very intricate, established trade, business, investment, and people to people links with the Gulf countries. If you look at the six GCC countries, there are such a large number of expatriates working in the region. There are a large number of Indian businesses already working in the region in variety of sectors, not in just one sector, not in only construction or domestic sector, services sector, business, retail, and then there is a continuous effort at the part of leaders like Mohammed bin Salman, who have been single-mindedly focused on bringing about an economic transformation. If you look at Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabia has emerged as one of the fastest growing G20 economies. If you look at different sectors, whether it is tourism, whether it is entertainment, whether it is sports, whether it is construction, retail, logistics, supply chain, shipping, you name it, IT, or issues related to strategic areas, AI and digital economy, where also India comes across as a very important partner. All these are you know growing and taking a leap forward, and that is where the opportunities for connecting with the region and beyond lies. We should also not forget the positive role the United States can play despite all the discussions about the US being, trying to pivot to Asia and pivot to Indo-Pacific, US foreign policy moving away from the Middle East, with this kind of an, approach, and earlier we had seen the launch of the minilateral of India, Israel, UAE, and United States, the I2U2, with focus on food security and energy security. So the US is playing, has first of all, one has to recognize that US has a certain degree of influence, certain degree of soft and hard power presence in the region, and that is something very important. To match that is not easy because it has been developed over a period of time. And then one also has to look at the European economies. Despite of the fact that many of the European economies have slowed down, they are, in terms of technological advancements, they are at the cutting edge. And that is something which is very important for countries like India and countries like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf and Middle Eastern countries. So if one looks at all these aspects, the financial heft of the Gulf countries, the human resource, and the aspirational, aspirations of India, and then the American influence, American and European technological advancements. If one brings all these together, if there is a synergy in all of these together, this can really transform the way the business is done, the way trades is done, and this is something which would be a win-win for everyone. All of the countries involved will benefit from it, and that is where the economic logic works. and comes into play.
And when you talk about this thing, that when the economic logic, as I quote you, that's at the center of things and the alliances, or for that matter, the memorandum of understandings. You said that most of the analysts would have said, they suggested that now the pivot to Indo-Pacific has actually given a different direction to the US foreign policy, because it has slightly, uh, you know, uh, came, again, from the axis it used to be on. Now that it has changed, and now it's back into the business, and there's a goodwill of the soft and hard power that USA has been earning over the time in the Middle Eastern region. But if now USA, if this corridor is executed in the right way and with the right endeavors, since the economic logic is at the center of it, and the collaboration is actually, it is triggered by this economic logic, what will happen if USA has a big stake in the region also again, if the corridor is executed? And apart from that, also the leftover things that are there in the Middle East, the current developments. Can we have a kind of an viewpoint that will actually include these multiple things in just a statement or two?
No, if you look at, for example, the United States, I had in my previous discussions also underlined this point that despite of the fact that US is kind of focusing more on Indo-Pacific and other regions as well, it is not going anywhere from as far as Middle East is concerned. So that is something which is very, very important to note, that the US will remain, is there and will remain in Middle East. Yes, the nature of the engagement has changed. It has become issue based. It has become, because the regional countries have begun to assert their strategic autonomy and their foreign policy independence. US also understands this. It suits its requirement actually, because US never was just trying to do everything from its own. It wanted, I mean, if you go back and check, US has been, there has been statements of American leaders urging the European countries, the Middle Eastern countries to take, some things in their hand. So that is something. It's a more of a, earlier it was US led system, regional system, regional order. Now it's more of a cooperative regional order, which is in the process of making. While US remains there is a cooperative system which is going to emerge, and India is likely to play a very, very significant role in this new system which is emerging in the region. The European countries are going to be playing an important role. This also does not mean that there would be no role for other countries. For example, Russia, China, or any other countries which may not necessarily be part of this corridor, or part of the discussions as far as the US-led process are concerned. But if you go back and check, Saudi Arabia has strategic relations with Russia. It has a strategic partnership with China, and it has also good relations with other countries. So one has to also look at it from a very pragmatic point of view, that it is the era of alliances, the era of following countries blindly and fully, in the sense that signing a blank check is over. All countries, all regional countries in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, they are focusing on issue based alignments and interest based alignments, and that is something, and so has the United States and so has India. So we have to be to take this also into consideration. If we look at the US foreign policy in the Middle East, India's approach towards the region, and the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia especially, Saudi Arabia's approach towards the US, India, and other international powers.
And if we talk about Mohammed bin Salman and President Erdogan, they were both participants in the summit. Do we see, like, realistically, Turkey and Saudi Arabia on the same page via this corridor. What do you make of that, sir?
You're talking about the exclusion of Turkey,
Yeah, I'm
Turkey
trying
from.
to actually make a point because I could see that there is not much enthusiasm when it comes to Turkey, and although Mohammed bin Salman has actually spoken about it in the event itself about the inclusive nature of this corridor and the economic transformation that will take place at the downstream of it, but Turkey hasn't been like so much in the limelight. How will the strategic community in the Turkey look at it if the development takes place in any time soon in future?
Yeah, this is a very important question. That brings us to something very, very significant, which is happening in the Mediterranean region. And in terms of relations between Turkey and the Middle Eastern countries and Turkey's foreign policy approach towards Europe and the United States, and the gradual, I would not say a decline in relations, but gradual complication in relations between Turkey and some of its older partners, be it the United States, the European countries, the Western European countries, or some of the partners in the Gulf countries as well. And here, one should also look at the complicated yet friendly, I mean, relations between India and Turkey. Although there are no outstanding problems between these two countries, the relations have been complicated. And the reason is a very, very, I would say, convoluted approach of Turkey in the past 2 decades towards some of its partner countries and friendly countries. Be it, for example, the way Turkey went about in Syria and Iraq, or how it tried to take advantage of the Arab Spring, decade of Arab Spring in the last since 2010-11 to 2020, where it tried to have a strategic inroad in the region to in towards its own advantage, and that was not necessarily liked by everyone. Although the relations, the diplomatic and political relations, have improved in the last 2 years. Saudi Arabia and Turkey have exchanged, now established again, revived their good relations. Diplomatic exchanges have taken place. The UAE and so Turkey also have kind of put their problematic relations on the back and have started to revive their economic, trade, and diplomatic relations. But there is something called trust deficit which comes into the picture here. And if you look at Turkey, there is a deficit of trust as far as India is concerned, as far as the United States is concerned, as far as the European countries are concerned, and so as the Gulf and other West Asian countries, including, for example, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, are concerned. And that is where the idea of Turkey being kind of not included in this corridor, wherein from Israel it can directly go to Greece and from there to European countries. So this is something which is important to understand, that Turkey, despite being a member of G20, despite Erdogan being present in New Delhi at that time, and despite, I would say, if I understand Turkey, they might have, had they been aware of what is going on, they might have been interested in being part of it. But then Turkey's policy has become more unpredictable. There is this degree of predictability which is lacking as far as Ankara is concerned. And that is something which is important to take note of. And these kind of mega projects cannot work with trust deficit and unpredictability. You need predictable partner, you need a trustworthy partner. And that is something which also binds India, the Gulf countries, Israel, and European Union countries, and the United States. There is a degree of trust that is missing as far as Turkey is concerned.
And one last thing before I wrap it up is that since you have been talking about India's engagement with the larger Middle Eastern region, and then via this corridor, there is a new sort of optimism that's being snowballed around this corridor that may take place anytime in the future. But that having been said, there's also one part of this corridor that's Europe, and the countries that have participated quite have been too much positive with the outcomes of the event in New Delhi. How will have what will it be the impact of this corridor to the European markets, to the European geopolitics via this Middle Eastern corridor? Do they have to rethink over their policies, or do they have to make slight changes and adjustments and readjustments with the policies via Middle East, via this Asian, especially the South Asian region?
Yes, I think this is again a very, very important question. If you look at the European Union countries and Europe as a whole, it has been facing several challenges. And this is not just because of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. That kind of amplified the problems the European Union has been facing, or European countries have been facing over the past few years and maybe a decade or so, going back to actually the economic problems, the global recession, which set in 2008. And they have not necessarily been able to very, very effectively recover from that kind of a economic shock. So, for example, the Brexit saga was also related to the economic challenges. We have seen countries like Greece and Spain facing extraordinary economic and financial troubles, and then there has been riots and protests in France with regard to unemployment, rising unemployment, and other such problems. You have Germany is perhaps the only country in the region in Europe which is economically stable and doing well. Italy also has faced certain economic challenges. So, in some ways, Europe was or is in a need for reconnecting with the world. Perhaps the European countries were becoming too inward looking, or their foreign policy was becoming too uh, based on ideals, not on economic interests. And that is something perhaps there is some degree of recognition now that it is important to also focus on economic issues. And the Russian attack and invasion of Ukraine has played some role. The European the return of European dependence on Gulf countries for their energy requirements is something which I think is one factor motivating them to refocus on these countries, the Gulf countries. There is also a degree of, I would say, diplomatic uh, discussions between the United States and European countries to understand as to why this region is important. And thirdly, there is also the larger politics of the Indian Ocean region. I mean, whether it is the Southeast Asia or Southwest Asia or the Gulf and Arabian Ocean, Arab Sea region, or the Eastern Indian Ocean region. This is something, this is where all the activities are taking place, whether it is the economic activity or political activity. And that is something which also I think has nudged the European countries to look beyond what they have been focusing on over the past decade or so. And this is something which is very important. So, if one looks at the India Middle East European economic corridor, all three components are important besides the American involvement. So all these four components have to really come together in terms of economic alignment, strategic alignment, and political a certain degree of political understanding, which will lead to the success of this economic corridor.